All right, so welcome to NESG Radio. My name is Shay Vincent. I'm your host for today. Today we'll be talking about the Host Community Development Trusts, HCDT, as stipulated in the Petroleum Industry Act. I am very pleased to have with me Dr. Obina DK. So Dr. Obina is a non-resident senior fellow with the NESG. He is an assistant professor of law at the American University of Nigeria, where he teaches international humanitarian, the Nigerian legal system, and the law of equity and trust. Dr. Obina is an expert in community sustainability and community benefit management systems. He has provided consultation, law, and policy advisory services to various local and international organizations, such as government agencies, corporations including oil and gas companies, the World Bank, and NATO. He currently advises Nigerian petroleum industry stakeholders on implementing the Petroleum Industry Act, particularly the operationalization of the Host Community Development Trust Fund. I am very pleased to have with me Dr. Obina DK. Dr. Obina, welcome to NESG Radio.
Thank you, Dr. Sheyi, for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Okay, so we'll be talking about host community development trusts as stipulated in the Petroleum Industry Act. So operators are required to establish a host community development trust, and this is something that's new territory to the Nigerian petroleum industry and probably also new territory to many people out there. So could you please just talk to us about community trusts, what they are, and speak specifically about the HCDT?
Okay, thank you for the question. Community trusts are... Okay, let me go back a little bit and talk about trusts generally. The trust funds are legal arrangements or legal framework designed by the grantor, that is the person who establishes the trust, to benefit a third party, which is called the beneficiary. And usually, to manage a trust, you require trustees, a trustee or trustees to manage that. With respect to the PIA and Chapter 3 in particular, which establishes this new framework, the Host Community Development Trust Fund. The trust was designed to create a formalized or a structured system of community beneficiation, that is a system of benefiting host communities in Nigeria. So a host community development trust is one of the benefit management systems that are available or exist around the world for taking care of or managing community interest in natural resource development. It exists not only in the oil and gas sector, but also in the mining sector. Before this framework was established, we used to have a voluntary system which was basically based on every company's CSR framework. That is corporate social responsibility policies of each company. So basically, each company is allowed to articulate what they think they can afford as a part of community benefits. So it usually comes under what was called MOUs, that is a Memorandum of Understanding. And in 2003 and between 2003 and 2005, Shell and Chevron came in with a new idea, which was called Global Memorandum of Understanding, that's a GMOU. And what the difference between the MOU and GMOU is that the Global Memorandum of Understanding tend to, aggregate communities. One of the purposes, one of the reasons why it was created was to aggregate communities into clusters and create a management system to administer community benefits. And the benefit of that is that it gave community stakeholders more participatory rights or more say input into how projects are determined or are selected, and the process of implementing and monitoring evaluation of projects. So that was where we were before 2021, when the PIA was enacted. So the PIA came up with this Host Community Development Trust Fund. It's not a new idea. It's been used in different parts of the world, but in Nigeria is quite novel, in the sense that we are graduating, moving from the voluntary system, unregulated framework of MOU and GMOUs, to now structured, backed by legislation framework, which is called the Host Community Development Trust Fund. And the Act, clearly from Section 234, stipulated the objectives of this framework and how it should run. One of the objectives is to facilitate the transfer of sustainable prosperity in host communities, the transfer or to foster sustainable prosperity in host communities. And the second one is to engineer or galvanize community development, host community development, and also to create a system of peaceful relations between the industry and host communities. And of course, you can understand why this is important as an objective, because we have had a system where, we have had issues of restiveness, militancy, and then obstructive behavior from host communities because of perceived grievances against the private sector actors, which are called settlors by the Act, the PIA. So they are designed to, one, warehouse fund, that is 3% contribution from the settler, that is the oil companies operating in their community. Once this fund is received, first of all, the companies are under obligation or obligated to set up host community development trust funds. So the trusts are established or created, incorporated by the companies operating in license holders in each community. So once this trust has been created, they also play a role in appointment of the members of the board of trustees of each of the trusts. And what are the requirements? Basically, the Acts have two requirements, which is to say that, one, anybody to be appointed into the membership of the board must be a person of high professional integrity. You can explain that however way you want to. That was not defined by the Act, but that means it must be somebody who is credible, somebody who is reputable, somebody who is established in one professional vocation or another. The second thing is that the person must come from the relevant community. Once that has been established, the trustee will then go ahead to appoint, and now we're looking at the structure of the trust fund. The board will then appoint the management committee of the trust fund, and then also go ahead to appoint the advisory board. They play different roles in trying to fulfill the mandate of the trust fund. So this is basically the background and the structure of the fund. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so we've been talking about the Host Community Development Trust and how petroleum industry operators, selected petroleum industry operators, are now required to establish the HCDT. So you've also touched on, what may have motivated this new stipulation in the law. You talked about, the need to manage community interest, community engagement, also to sort of, prevent or, ensure that there are no, issues in terms of restiveness between the settlers and, community participants. So can you just speak generally about what you think may have motivated the introduction of the HCDT into the Petroleum Industry Act? Is this specified in the Act, or is it just something that can just be deduced based on happenings within the area?
Yes, it can be deduced from the realities of the Nigerian environment. And also, when you look at the Act, Section 234 and 235, it's also easy to adduce or deduce the reasons, the basis for this process. One is that we have had the problem of the Niger Delta is dated now. It's been there for a long time. Issue of restiveness, issue of obstructive behaviors and tampering with oil and gas installations. And also the allegations that companies usually, or some companies don't usually fulfill what they have promised under their MOUs. Because of course that was a voluntary arrangement based on the CSR, like policies of companies, like I said earlier. So it was not regulated. It was determined largely by what a company is willing to commit to in a particular community, and how the capacity of the community, or to exert some leverage over a company to maybe get better deal. But largely it was unregulated. It was largely determined by negotiations or arrangement between the host community stakeholders and then the companies in question. So these are generally the two parties to the MOUs and GMOUs. Now, we have issues of lack of development in the Niger Delta as well. The accusation or allegation that the oil and gas development in the Niger Delta has not benefited the communities as it should. And that raises a question of some of the measures that have been in place before the act, this particular act came into being, the PIA. Before then we have the derivation fund under section 162 of the Constitution. We have the Niger Delta Development Commission. We also have the Ministry of Niger Delta. These were agencies of government established to facilitate or accelerate host community development. But that has not really worked, for the people at the grassroots, and that is why sometimes you see the call for instance, the derivation fund, which is usually paid to the government of the state, the governors, to be directed to the host communities who bear the consequences of oil and gas development directly, for them to use and develop their own communities. So I think that necessitated it was one of the needs for this particular act to be brought in. So this is supposed to enable communities have a greater influence, greater say in how their communities develop in terms of project articulation, project implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So this kind of would give the community, if well implemented anyway, would give communities greater say in how the development objectives or projects are run in those communities. So these are generally the reasons why I think this Host Community Development Trust Fund has been inserted into the Petroleum Industry Act 2021.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much for that answer. So you already sort of talked about this. So before the enactment of the PIA, so host community development initiatives were broadly in two separate categories. One is, the operators voluntarily instituting community development initiatives. You've already touched on that, based on corporate social responsibility, for example. And then the other was, government-led initiatives such as the NDDC, which you also talked about. And you've mentioned how, this sort of left a lot to be desired and was oftentimes unsuccessful. So now, can we just talk specifically about how this trust arrangement is different from these sorts of arrangements that, the previous arrangements that existed before the PIA, and how it would work? So, operationalizing the HCDT.
So the answer is that the current framework is a largely industry-led, industry-initiated process. The previous ones have been creations of statutes where government created agencies, and appointed politicians to implement programs towards community development or general state development in the Niger Delta states. However, this one was created, and the settlors, that is the companies operating in these communities, have been mandated, or we are mandated to, first of all, establish the trust. So the responsibility to establish or to create a host community development trust fund lies with the settlors. After the creation, it is also the responsibility of the settlors to appoint, in consultation with the relevant host communities, appoint members of the board who will then, select a chairman from amongst them. So you see that this is a legal entity on its own, in the function of a company, so to say, while the other ones have been government agencies, manned by politicians or people who are connected to politics and all of that to implement government programs. But this will be wholly, after creation, the affairs of each host community development trust will be run by the organs of the trust, starting with the members of the boards of trustees. So, to a large extent, this will be community-driven system of development or beneficiation for individual host communities. So, you now will have a situation where members of the communities under a particular trust will determine the projects that will be selected or considered by the management committee and the board for execution. So they determine from the beginning to the end what needs to come to the table, what is relevant, what is necessary for each community, what project needs to be executed, and in the order of their execution. So this is essentially a community-led arrangement. And also, it creates a pathway or a structure for income, where income, the resources of the trust will come from, how it will be utilized, and I think at some point we may go into the detail about how the trust, where the sources of the fund, which essentially come from the 3% operating expenditure of each company, will be paid into the trust. Also, the monies can be generated from grants, honoraria, and other gifts to the trust. The trust also has an obligation to kind of make investments. So monies will be invested, a certain percentage of the total income will be invested, and then any profit or interest on those will also be applied, in community development. So that is basically how this is different from what we used to have. So now we have a compulsory system which a company must establish, and the timelines for their establishment is also stated by law. And we have a lot of them, over 41 or 45 of them already established. Some of them are preparing to get into operation. Some of them are, less prepared or not up to that point of starting their operations. So these are the areas in which the current arrangement is different from what existed before it.
Great, fantastic. So I hear, greater consultation with the community. There's also greater community engagement, involvement, for example, in, the projects that are executed, consultation in the appointment of members of the board. So we see that, the communities are more, infused in decision making. So that's, I think that's one clear thing that comes out of what you've said. Okay, so can we now speak about the beneficiaries of these trusts?
The beneficiaries of the trusts are the host communities, people who are defined by the Act as host communities. And this is a very important aspect of this process, in my own opinion, because by the Act, the settlors also have the powers to determine who their host communities or a host community is within their license area. So that means that a company can decide, depending on what they do in each community, not only where you have the wellhead, but where you have substantial operation of a company can decide, based on the level of their involvement or engagement with the community, to decide to include that particular community as part of the host communities for the purposes of the trust. And my own view is that it is better to be expansive rather than be too restrictive in determining who a host community is. So the answer to the question, first of all, is that the host communities are the beneficiaries, but you have to then determine who the host communities are. And I said that by the Act, the settlors determines who their host communities would be in the context of, or within the context of the trust fund. And recently, there was an issue that was published in the paper, I think that was a week or thereabout ago, where a community in Warri Delta State protested because, according to them, they were not included in the Otumara Host Community Development Trust, which was established recently in that area. And they felt that they should have been included because of, according to them, they have a flow station in their community that produces up to 20,000 barrels per day. You know, that cannot be verified, but that was the allegation. But the important point that being made here is that it is important to carefully determine who the host communities are, because if that is not done, it may eventually defeat the purpose of this arrangement, which is to ensure peaceful engagement between the settlers and their host communities. So if you see after this arrangement, and we continue to have issues of vandalism, issues of restiveness, protests, obstructive behaviors, then one of the objectives of the Act may not have been met. And that is why I think it's important to carefully determine who comes under the umbrella of the host communities. And another important thing which the Act does not expressly provide for is community engagement, which is essentially a relationship building tool or mechanism to ensure that a company is able to secure the social license to operate in a community and also to sustain it throughout the life cycle of the project. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So it's important to determine the territory of the host communities so as to ensure that everyone who is supposed to benefit from the trust benefits from the trust. Okay, so now let's talk about whether this is a welcome development or not. So do you think that this HCDT structure is a welcome development for those living in these communities? And what would you say are the expected benefits of the new system? So you've already touched on this quite a bit, but on the whole, would you say that those living in these communities will welcome this new structure?
Yes, I think it is a big development and it is welcome. It should be appreciated, it should be applauded. But however, a lot would depend on getting every bit of the process right. This is a new area to Nigeria for Nigerians. So it is important to make sure that we get everything that we need to put in place to ensure that the benefits are maximized. But to be sure, it is a welcome development in this community, because this is like giving powers back to the community, increasing community participation in the way in the determination of how developments are done in their community. And this is consistent with the principle under international law that is called the principle of subsidiarity, which is that those who are directly affected by a thing or development systems are given the opportunity to have a greater say or have greater participation in deciding how the process of their beneficiation, process of their development are done. So it's a welcome development because for the first time, the host communities and the members of these communities would have a lot more say in project selection, in determining what is done and the priority, what is given priority in host communities. And I think that has never happened before. But we see how people who have some reservation, again, it's important to have a framework, but how that process or framework is implemented will be critical to whether the potential benefits will be realized at the end of the day. So this system will make more money that are directly available to host communities, which they can then decide based on what they think their needs assessment is, to determine, put a plan in place and execute projects to ensure that what they consider to be their needs are met not only for now, but in the future. And that is why, for the first time also, this act is introducing the concept of sustainable development. And that is why they talked about fostering sustainable prosperity in host communities. So, and that is a key part of this arrangement for me. And that means that we need to start identifying, contextualizing what sustainable development would mean for each and every community, because that has to be articulated, that has to be processed, first of all, to ensure that projects selected and executed are projects which will promote and advance the sustainability of these communities post the oil cycle. That means at the end of the projects in their communities, this process should be able to set a platform for these communities to continue to exist meaningfully going forward. So I think the benefits are very much and huge benefits, in the sense that the projects will be selected, communities will participate and take greater level of decision in project selection, execution, monitoring, oversight. So at the end of the day, it means that the communities will determine to a great extent how their community would move forward from now. So that is what I think the benefits should be.
Great, fantastic. So in general, we expect that, those living in these communities will welcome the host community development trust. So the issue now is to try to maximize the benefits of these trusts and to ensure that implementation goes on smoothly and effectively. So yes, thank you very much for that. Okay, so now let's talk about the challenges. So again, you highlighted how implementation is key, and implementation can be a huge barrier to many wonderful initiatives. So what are the likely challenges in operationalizing the HCDT framework?
Thank you. There are a number of them. First of all, I think training and capacity building will be very important, considering that this is a novel arrangement for us, and the people who will be appointed, many of them may not, have had the experience of understanding the concept of a trust and the important issue of fostering sustainable development in these communities. So there are key issues which we need to expand on, and that will come, amongst other things, through capacity building and through engagement with the various stakeholders, because it is important to make sure that we also make every stakeholder to understand their respective roles in ensuring that this process succeeds. For instance, the companies, most of them have started their bids, which is by incorporation and appointment of members into the boards of trustees, and they will have oversight rules as these trusts established. These trusts that have been established, they will have a lot of oversight functions to ensure that things are done properly and in line with the Act, because they also will have returns and filing to be made to the regulatory authority. So, secondly, I think I've mentioned that issue before, which is the question of articulating or properly identifying the beneficiaries of the trust. Considering that one of the purposes of establishing the Host Community Development Trust is to ensure that there is peace, sustainable peace in the host communities, that companies are allowed to do their business without harassment, without unnecessary protest, and then free from all this vandalization of assets in those communities. It therefore becomes important to ensure that every body or every community who is relevant to the activity or activities of a company in their area is brought on board. It doesn't mean that every community will benefit at the same level as, for instance, a community where you have the wellhead, where the community that probably will suffer the most from in terms of the disadvantages of oil and gas development. So you could have a system where you have 1, 2, 3 communities, because the company's assets are in those communities, beginning from an asset of the highest importance to the one of lowest importance. So it's important to make sure that everybody who can qualify as host community is brought on board, and then we can then create. There's already a matrix on how you can then allocate resources and benefit to each community, depending on their level of participation, their level of the stake that each community has in a company's operation. So that, I think, is key. So in summary, we need to get the issue of capacity building done. We need to also make sure that the structures of the trust are properly instituted, and that every organ of the trust is properly briefed on what they need to do. And also, this aspect of sustainability is also, in my own opinion, new, because of course I know the subject matter of sustainable development has been there for a long time, but now we are looking at sustainable development or fostering sustainable prosperity in host communities within the context of oil and gas development that is finite in nature, which means that the expectation of resources from these companies will only be valid to the extent that these companies continue to maintain profitable businesses in those communities. So once a company decommissions from a community, the community will no longer have access to that operating cost, 3% of the operating cost. So it means that we need to make sure that everything that we need to put in place, which are some of the things that I've mentioned, are put in place, and those who are in charge of the day-to-day running of the trust are properly equipped to discharge their functions, so that at the end of the day, the goal of ensuring sustainable prosperity in host communities will be met. So these are the challenges which I think we will need to work on. And there also one more thing, the issue of community engagement. The subject of community engagement is, in my own opinion, has not been properly understood in Nigeria. Community engagement is a relationship building instrument or mechanism, like I said. So it's a process of cultivating the relationship between the industry and their host communities. And the purpose of that cultivation of relationship is to build trust and to sustain trust along the line of the relationship. And this community engagement is not a one-off thing, and community development is not about project development in host communities. It is about relationship. It is about creating relationships and sustaining that relationship through information sharing, through engagement, sustained engagement, and other tools. And in this current arrangement, there is no provision regarding community engagement, which means now that the companies will be divesting or handing over some of the things they have done directly to the host community development trust, who will be responsible for managing the relationship between the industry and their host communities. Will it be the company? Will the companies continue to engage directly with their host communities, or will this also devolve to the host community development trust fund? That is not clear in the Act. Is not also clear in the regulation which has been put up by the Nigerian Upstream Regulatory Commission. So it is important that we understand the importance of community engagement and to ensure that that is sustained, that is instituted properly and sustained, because without that, we still stand the risk of having restiveness, protest, and obstructive behaviors in the communities. Projects or the activities of the trust now will not equate to the needs or resolve the need to have sustained engagement between the industry and their host community. So I think this needs to be addressed to ensure that we don't go back to the days of, or we don't continue to perpetuate the situation of the contest of grievances and obstructive behaviors in host communities. And lastly, there's the provision of Section 257, I think, which is called, some people have called it the penalty clause, but I choose to call it the responsibility clause. It provides that every community will be responsible for any damage that happens, any damage to installations of the oil and gas companies in their communities. So that means that if an oil asset is damaged in a host community, for instance, a bus pipeline or any other asset is damaged in a host community, and it is determined that the cause of that damage was a result of human interference from the host community, the host community will suffer some penalty, in the sense that any cost of repairing or restoring the damaged installation will be borne by the community. It means that the company will be free to deduct the cost of restoration of that asset from what they pay into the trust at the end of the day. But there is a mechanism to ascertain the cost of the destruction, and the company, how the company projects the cost of the repair. The Nigerian Upstream Regulatory Commission has enough role to play in ensuring that everything is transparent, everything is fair, so that once it is established that a damage occurred because of community interference, and the company has expended a certain sum of money to restore that asset, you can determine the cost of that restoration, and then that will be deducted from what the communities will get at the end of the day. So it's important to also do a lot of sensitization around this, so that it will not be misunderstood, because I've heard in different forums where some people have raised some grievances around the utility or the usefulness of this arrangement, so that it is not misunderstood and so that it doesn't create problems for both the industry, the state, and the host communities. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so you've sort of talked about my next question. So it's to do with the recommendations to overcome some of the challenges you've highlighted. So you've already talked about like capacity building, for example, the importance of, properly engaging the community. You talked about sensitization with regards to the responsibility clause. So are there any other recommendations that you'd like to put forward, to overcome any of the challenges that might be encountered with the HCDT framework?
Yes, I think two more, and that will be the needs assessment, which is usually the starting point. Need assessment articulates the needs, the social, economic, and environmental needs of each community. And from that needs assessment, development plan for that particular community or host communities will be determined or will be prepared, which the trust will then begin to implement. So it is important to take time to do a proper needs assessment. And needs assessment are usually context specific. What the need of community A is may be different from the needs of community B. So it's important to make sure that the context of each community is properly understood, and that will also relate to the demographics, the size of the community, the age differentials in the community, and maybe the level of education capacity. What if there is need for what is the educational level, basically the minimal educational level of each community? Are there things that needs to be put in place to enhance what a community needs to be sustainable going forward? So needs assessment is very important, and also development plan must reflect those needs and be executed in a way that is progressive and also takes advantage of the spatial environment. That is important. Special planning will be essential to the success and sustainability of what the trust does or will do going forward, because you have a situation where you have, for instance, you have the NDDC doing some project in some communities or in a state. You have various agencies of government doing one thing or another, interventionist measures in communities. There should be, a special arrangement which can link, where you can provide linkages, connect greater number of communities and then deepen and expand the scale and the range of community beneficiation. I think this will be important, ensuring that we don't have development in silos, because the obligations of each trust is limited to their host communities. So where you have other communities which are not classified as host communities, you will see that the development will be centered in these host communities, while other communities who are not so classified will be left unattended to. So where there are opportunities to leverage other systems, other mechanisms of development, that should be done to ensure that the scale of development is expanded and deepened for the benefit of the greater number of communities. That would be my concluding words on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Obinna. So it's been a great conversation with Dr. Obinna Dike. I'm sure you all agree with me. So, Dr. Obinna, thank you for your very interesting insights.
Thank you for having me. Very grateful.
Thank you. So thank you to our listeners for tuning in. For more information, visit www.network.org/podcast. Until next time. Bye for now.